Corey, I think we're live.
Yes, I think so as well. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll just wait a few minutes while we admit everyone into the room here. Okay, perfect. So I think we can get started. I'll just take a minute to introduce myself. So I'm Carrie. I'm the product manager for the carbon neutral solution at Green Story. Um, I'll tell you a bit about Green Story as well, just before we dive in. So our vision at Green Story is to enable every consumer on the planet to ask, what's my impact while making a purchase? As a company, we work with brands from startups to enterprise clients to measure and visualize the impact of their supply chains. So we've recently launched our newest product. It's a carbon offsetting system to not only make your products carbon neutral, but really involve and integrate the consumer into the process. So we're kicking off our webinar series this week, zeroing in on neutrality today. And the series will showcase carbon offsetting from all angles. So this is sharing the perspective of each stakeholder the topic touches. If you have any questions and you want to engage in the discussion, just type them out in the question or chat box and we'll get to them after our discussion. And if you want to take part in the discussion online, you can tag us at Green Story Inc. on our social channels. So the webinar session today is going to be a bit of a 101 guide to all things carbon offsetting. And before we jump in, I will just preface that the discussion is going to start from the basics. So we all kind of have our bases covered and are on the same page. We're going to be learning about how carbon offsetting works, why it's important, and the process to leave nothing behind. So you're going to hear from Green Story's very own about how we choose the right projects to support and what our motivation for building our plug-and-play solution is to zero in on neutrality. And now to the good stuff. It's my great pleasure to introduce our co-founder and CTO, Nav, who is going to provide us all the insights on carbon offsetting. So let's jump right in with the first question. We'll start with, what are carbon emissions and why do we even care about them?
Thanks, Corey. Hi, everyone. So I think most of us here are aware of carbon emissions and heard about climate change. But just to set the context, in case you're not aware, large-scale human activity such as burning fossil fuels for heat, electricity, and transportation, as well as clearing forests, agriculture and livestock management, and landfill decomposition, all these activities emit a tremendous amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. And these GHG emissions are one of the largest contributors of the rapidly increasing global temperatures and the devastating effects of climate change, which we are seeing, such as rising sea levels, intense heat waves, persistent droughts, flash floods, water scarcity, and so on. In fact, we have released over 36 gigatons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere last year, compared to just about 2 gigatons in early 1900s. And scientists have determined that we need to limit our increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100 if we have to mitigate most severe effects from climate change. And for this to happen, we need to reduce our emissions by less than or up to 25 gigatons by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. However, with the current pace of climate emissions, carbon emissions and climate policies in place, the emissions are set to rise above 50 gigatons by 2030. And what that means is that the increase in temperature would be more than 3 degrees by 2100, leading to major climate crises.
So obviously that's not good. What can be done about this?
Right. I mean, there are a lot of things which can be done by the government and the individuals like us, but I think that's a complete separate topic for a separate webinar. But primarily from a company's perspective, there are three main things which can be done. First and foremost is to reduce emissions within your company and your supply chain. And these are some of the things which you can do is, reduce travel, upgrade to machine which is more energy efficient, switch to renewable energy, or, change your suppliers which are more sustainable. But these things might take months and years to do. And so you'll need to start today if you have to reduce your emissions seriously. The other thing which can be done is carbon insetting. Now, in this case, what happens is you actually work with the current suppliers and in your supply chain to implement carbon reduction projects, which will finally reduce emissions in your supply chain. So you work with your partners today. And finally, is the carbon offsetting, which is the topic for today.
Awesome. So if carbon offsetting is a step we can take, could you tell us a little bit about what carbon offsets are and how they function?
Right. So carbon offsetting simply means balancing your unavoidable carbon emissions, or what we call carbon footprint, by reductions or carbon emissions avoided outside your supply chain to projects such as wind farms, reforestation, or clean cook stores, for example. The first step in carbon offsetting is obviously to measure your unavoidable emissions or footprint within your operations and your value chain. Next, you would actually buy the carbon equivalent or carbon credits equivalent to your carbon footprint through verified carbon offset projects. Now, a typical carbon credit means basically 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide avoided or reduced. So if you're buying 10 credits, it means you are avoiding 10 metric tons of carbon dioxide through offset projects. The next step basically is all once you buy these projects, they finance these carbon offset projects, which finally prevent future carbon emissions and remove the CO2 already in the atmosphere. And if you balance out all your emissions across your supply chain, across your company, then your net emissions become zero, and that is what we also call carbon neutral. So you can be a carbon neutral company, a carbon neutral product, a carbon neutral event, anything can be made carbon neutral.
So this idea of buying carbon offsets and carbon neutrality seems like there's a lot to it. Could you tell us a little bit about the different types of carbon offset projects that are available?
Right. So there are a lot of different carbon offset projects, and it will be the easiest way to understand about them is thinking about how they avoid or reduce emissions. So based on how they tackle emissions, you can divide them in four main types. Projects which avoid emissions. So these would typically be renewable energy projects like wind, solar, biomass, geothermal. These projects basically, replace energy from fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, and that's how they avoid emissions. The next set would be projects which reduce emissions from fossil fuels. So these typically would be energy efficiency projects like lighting retrofit or upgrading your machinery, clean cook stoves, providing to people in Africa where they are currently using firewood. So these projects reduce the use of fossil fuels and then hence reduce the emissions. The third type of projects are projects which remove the currently or existing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And these are typically nature-based solutions like planting trees through reforestation and afforestation, avoiding planned or unplanned deforestation, which is typically happening in Brazil. They were clear-cutting forests, or improved soil management, which then finally sequesters more carbon in the soil. Beyond that, there are other projects where they are using carbon dioxide, capturing it from the atmosphere to make new products like kind of cement blocks, which can be used in construction. And the fourth project type are projects that destroy some of the greenhouse gas emissions, I think primarily methane, which is one of the potent greenhouse gas, 25 times more global warming potential than carbon dioxide. And this typically happens in a landfill where you can collect the landfill gas, which is methane, and flare it just to destroy it, or you can use it to create electricity. So that's how the four project types are defined.
Super interesting. And I guess there's like thousands of different types of offset projects on the market based on like different sections of those project types. So how do you ensure that these projects are like high quality, really functioning, and like just ensure the quality of the carbon credits themselves?
Right. So there are a bunch of criteria which you need to take into account to make sure that the offset which you're buying is high quality. And the first one is additionality. So what additionality means is that the projects which you are, buying credits from, they wouldn't have occurred if the financing from the selling of this carbon credits would have arrived. So if, let's say, there is a government regulated mandate that you have to offset your emissions, and a project is done for that, then that would not be an additional project. Versus, other projects where the funding is coming from offsets would be an additional project. The second main criteria is permanence. So all the emissions which are being avoided or removed or reduced by these carbon offset projects, that should be permanent and long lasting. And one of the major issues with projects which are removing carbon dioxide, for example, through reforestation or avoided land deforestation, is that there's a risk of them not being permanent in case there is a fire in the
Mm.
forest, or again activity gets started again, like clear cutting or land use change. In that case, they might not be permanent. So we need to ensure that all the emissions which are avoided or reduced are permanent. The third thing, which is quantification. So how much amount of carbon dioxide is avoided or reduced, that needs to be accurately and scientifically calculated and quantified. And then it obviously needs to be audited by third party to make sure that the calculations are in fact correct, and then verified from time to time, so that to ensure that the avoiding or the reduction is actually happening during the project period. So we need continuous monitoring of all these offset projects. The fifth and very important thing is traceability, or what we call unique ownership. So this is to ensure that the carbon credits which are sold are not sold multiple times to offset emissions for different companies, because there are what we call fraud in the system, or it might just be a missing of the accounting of the carbon ownership. So
Hmm.
traceability is really important to ensure that it's only used once and not multiple times. The sixth important criteria is sustainability and adherence to social development goals. So what sustainability means here is that all the projects should adhere to the currently existing environmental and social guidelines or regulations where the project is happening, but it should not have any negative environmental consequences when it's undertaken. And a good example would be a large hydro project, right? And a large hydro project can have massive impact on the surrounding environment. It displaces people. So in that case, any large hydro project would typically not be considered a high quality carbon offset project. And that's why most, if you'll see in the carbon offset scenario, would be small hydro projects.
Hmm.
Even those would need to be carefully considered, that they are still not having any major consequences on the environment. And better yet would be that all these projects, in addition to offsetting or avoiding carbon, also have contribute to UN Sustainable Development Goals, like improving health, reducing poverty, access to water and energy, those kind of things. And finally is the leakage, which basically means that by creating an offset project, it should not happen that emissions are now happening somewhere else, or they're moved from the current source to some other area, which
Hmm.
can happen in case of reforestation projects, where we have stopped logging in that particular area, but we have started logging somewhere else, which kind
Mm.
of negates the entire usefulness of having that offset project in the first place.
Right.
Right. And I mean, as a company, you don't need to go and look at each of these criteria, because that would be a very tedious task to do.
Yeah.
And this is where the project development standards come in place. And there are quite a few. In fact, four of the main ones. And the first is the UN Clean Development Mechanism, developed by UNFCCC under the Kyoto Protocol.
Hmm.
which was the first standard to come. And then we have gold standard, which is developed by WWF and based on CDM. In fact, gold standard is considered to be one of the most stringent and
Hmm.
highest quality offset standard available today. Then we have verified carbon standard from Vera, which is one of the largest or most a lot of projects use the VCS standard. And
Hmm.
then there's a regional standard, which is Climate Action Reserve, which primarily certifies projects in North America. So if your project is certified by any of these international standards, then they're typically of very high quality.
Right. And in discussions around carbon offsetting, I've heard terms such as like compliance market and the voluntary market being used. And I found at first that they could be quite confusing. So would you be able to tell us, I guess, what they are, and then just give us a little bit of more detail about the carbon offset landscape? Because it does seem like there's quite a few different layers to it.
Right. So from a carbon credit perspective, there is no difference between compliance and voluntary market. One carbon credit still means that somewhere 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide has been avoided or removed. What differentiates between the compliance market versus the voluntary market is that compliance market includes all the government regulated programs that requires countries and larger industries to reduce emissions as per the government mandate. And basically, these companies would have to buy carbon offsets, which are sold through programs which have, restrictions in terms of the project types which can be used, the project locations, and the quality of offset. Now, in case of voluntary market, basically these are used by individual consumers or businesses which do not have any regulatory requirement to reduce their emissions, but they would voluntarily take responsibility to offset or take response for the climate impact. And there is no restriction in terms of which projects they use, what type of
Mhm.
projects, their location, or the quality of the offset.
Okay.
So that's a kind of main difference between compliance and voluntary market.
Hmm.
And in terms of the overall carbon market landscape, I mean, it's quite complex. So what I would do is basically think of it as three primary layers. The bottommost layer is the most important, which is the what we have here, the projects layer, which includes all the project developers, the project operators, auditors, which run the project.
Hmm.
Then the standards such as CDM or gold standard, which will make sure the quality of the project is appropriate, and the financing organizations which would provide initial financing to the offset projects. And the next layer would be the reseller layer, which includes companies and not-for-profits who are selling these carbon offsets, but are not actually producing them. Green Story would be one of the resellers in that sense. And finally is the buyer layer, which includes all the individuals and companies which buy the offsets from resellers or project developers.
So leading up to this, you've kind of made a compelling point for why carbon offsets are important. But I guess another question, another layer to that is why should a company buy carbon offsets and incorporate that into their business model?
Right. So, I mean, in addition to achieving the 2030 targets or 2050 targets, which we all have to finally get to, I think a carbon offsetting really helps demonstrate your commitment on climate change to all your stakeholders. And in addition to reducing emissions within your own operations, it can also help reduce emissions across your value chain, which helps you, start the journey towards a net zero target, which we all have to achieve by 2050. It also helps take responsibility for your entire carbon footprint, not just within your company, but across your value chain, where you do not have control, for example, as suppliers.
Hmm.
Also, some of the emissions which cannot be reduced in short term, for example, air travel, which we all have to do for business or even going to your workplace. So those kind of emissions can be offset using this. And finally, all this financing stimulates the market for clean energy technologies, energy efficient technologies, which in turn would help reach us the 2030 and 2050 targets.
Totally. And I mean, we hear those targets being talked about pretty often if you're in the sustainability space, but it's really not just the big goals that are pushing companies, brands right now to do their part to achieve them. I know if everyone's been keeping up in the news, we're seeing a big shift in consumer sentiment around sustainability and around carbon neutrality. So what do you think of that, Nav?
Right. I mean, absolutely, there's a major change in consumer awareness about carbon emissions and climate change over the last year, and thanks in major part to Greta Thunberg and all our protest campaigns and COVID-19, which has made us all aware about effects of change in climate, environment, and around that stuff, right? And in addition to that, we actually did a recent survey just to understand what consumers are thinking and feeling about the carbon offsets. And to be frank, results are very astonishing even for us. What we found
Mm-hmm.
out was that carbon offsetting has definitely hit the mainstream. Almost 84% of respondents said they have heard about carbon offsetting, and even better, that 75% of them know about carbon neutrality, which is awesome because last year I think the awareness was much lower.
Mm-hmm.
And 70% of consumers actually believe today that companies should offset their emissions across their entire supply chain and not just within the company operations itself. And but the best news is that 76% of consumers said that they would be more likely to buy a product if it is sustainable, but is also carbon neutral. And I mean, and it's not just our survey. I mean, there are tons of other publications like Business of Fashion, Vogue, who have kind of published the same kind of results, which are in line with our own findings in terms of change in consumer sentiment.
Yeah, which is awesome to see this kind of hitting the mainstream and awareness being like growing so much. And I guess with consumer sentiment changing and demanding more sustainable and conscious consumption, this kind of leads us into what Green Story's role in all of this is and how we're getting involved in this.
Right. So, I mean, Green Story's focus from the very beginning has been to bring a consumer-centric experience to sustainability with
Mhm.
credible, transparent, and easy to understand impact data for shoppers, and basically make it accessible to all the companies, whether it's big or small. And we wanted to bring the same consumer-centric experience and principles to the carbon offsetting ecosystem. So basically, with our system now, we can convince the shoppers that buying carbon neutral products is really making an environmental impact and helping the communities where these offset projects are being developed. So our system involves the consumers with carbon neutrality across the shopping experience, both pre and post purchase, and there's full transparency in terms of the offset projects and the credit retirements.
And it's really exciting, and I guess this is kind of why we're chatting about this right now. But we're excited to be talking about our tool. And could you just tell us a little bit about how the Zero Neutrality carbon offset system works and functions?
Right. So, I mean, it's pretty simple in terms of how it works. There are four main steps. Obviously, first is to calculate the carbon footprint for each of your product across the value chain. And the next step would be, selecting the right offset projects based on your supply chain and, your company and customer values.
Mhm.
The third thing which happens then is, we integrate with your e-commerce or your in-store system so that we can immerse your consumer with the accurate details about carbon neutrality and the offset projects while they shop. And finally, we celebrate, the carbon neutrality milestones as they happen month after month with your customers to make sure that, we are on track to achieving our goals, reducing our emissions, and achieving our 2030 targets.
Which is exciting and awesome. And so you mentioned that you're looking at the footprint for each product. So how is Green Story actually calculating the footprint at the product level specifically?
Right. So in order to calculate the footprint at a product level, we have to look at, what we call cradle to grave, which includes every step along the product's value chain, starting from, raw material acquisition, manufacturing, distribution, shipping, use phase, and disposal. And there are primarily two methodologies available today to look at the carbon footprint. One is the GHG protocol product footprint, which
Mhm.
looks at emissions from scope one, which is your own company's emissions, scope two, which is emissions from the electricity which you have bought, and scope three emissions, which are your value chain emissions, both upstream and downstream. And then there is a life cycle assessment, which is very similar to the GHG protocol, which is the ISO 14044 standard, to again calculate footprint from cradle to grave. What we use primarily is a life cycle assessment methodology because it not only helps us calculate the carbon footprint, but also a lot of other environmental metrics which are important, such as fossil energy demand, water consumption, eutrophication, toxicity, which are really critical when you start looking at reducing your impact. So it's not just about carbon emission reduction, but you need to look at are you using the right energy? Are you reducing your water consumption? Are you reducing your eutrophication impact, toxicity, all of those things? And that's why we decided to keep on going with the life cycle assessment, where we can help companies, not only reduce the carbon but also, overall environmental impact.
Right. And so once you get to the point where you're able to establish the carbon footprint at the product level, how do you go about the actual project selection once you're ready to start purchasing offsets? Could you break that down for us a little bit?
Right. I mean, so we did a lot of research and work with a few of the experts to figure out what's the best way to select the project. And what it came down to was, we should select the projects which provide immediate impact in avoiding and reducing carbon, so we can really achieve the 2030 targets.
Hmm.
So what that means is we look for projects which are closely aligned with our client supply chain locations and has a mix of renewable energy, avoided deforestation, and community projects. A majority of the weightage goes to renewable energy projects, almost 70%, primarily because the emissions from them are permanent and immediate, and also help economies transition to sustainable energy. The next thing we make sure is all the projects have the highest standards. So typically it would be gold standard, CDM, or VCS certified projects. But the most important thing for us is to make sure that we provide full transparency on the projects, the offset credit requirements, and the offset credit cost to our clients. So basically, what we will do is for our fiber production, in case it's fashion, we will choose a deforestation project. For all the product manufacturing, we'll choose renewable energy projects, and all transportation, shipping, and beyond that, we'll choose a community project to offset. And the reason why the transparency is so important for us is that we do not add any markup to the prices of the offset credit. So whatever price we procure the project at, we pass the same price to our clients. And the reason is because there is too much margins right now built in the entire offset ecosystem. You can buy the same project or same project credit for $5, for $10, and $20, but what
Hmm.
might be going to the actual project operational cost might just be $2. So you might think, oh, I have spent $20 buying this, but at the end a lot of that margin might just be in the middle tier and nothing is just the product developers. So that's one of the things we want to change with our product and our approach.
Right, right. And I guess we've made a very good case for businesses um, kind of incorporating carbon offsetting. There's definitely, we've talked about that, but what change do we need to see to really see a difference? And kind of like, what is the future we see for sustainability in addition to carbon offsetting or in the realm of carbon offsetting?
Right. I mean, in terms of offsetting, what we're seeing a lot of partnerships across the ecosystem and collaboration in the offset industry. I think this will provide some new solutions to our clients to not only offset the carbon, but also reduce their carbon and make a much larger impact. So what it means is directly working with project developers and also bringing consumers in the fold. Because I mean, unless the consumer gets involved, and really put pressure on the companies and demand offset or reducing the emissions, not much change will happen. So I think that's pretty important. The other thing which is there is moving beyond just climate carbon neutral. So what we are seeing is a lot of companies are going climate positive via reforestation and afforestation projects, which I think are really critical beyond just using renewable energy. Because if we have to achieve our 2050 targets, which is
Hmm.
going net zero on emissions, there has to be a lot of carbon sequestration. Because at that point, we might have removed all the emissions which are avoidable and only left with unavoidable emissions, which we'll need a lot of projects, sequestration projects to do that.
Hmm.
But then going beyond carbon neutral also means looking at other things like water, going water neutral. And water scarcity is turning out to be a big issue, especially in developing countries. So that's one other area which we need to focus on beyond just carbon neutral. And finally, the third thing is, I think we need to create a right infrastructure for our supply chains so that they can, move to renewable energy, sustainable farming, which is already being done by a couple of companies through the carbon insetting thing, which I talked about, to really
Right,
reduce the carbon footprint of our entire value chain and not just about our company.
right. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nav. That was super interesting and nice deep dive into such an urgent matter. And we have some questions that we'll dive into now. And if anyone has any other questions, please just put them in the chat box and we're going to try to get through a few of them. So, first, we'll start with a question from Lauren. And the question, Nav, is what role would you recommend carbon offset purchases take in a corporation's sustainability roadmap? Should they just be supplementary or the first steps on a company's roadmap to sustainability?
Yeah, I think they should be supplementary. I mean, first thing you need to definitely look at is think about reducing your emissions,
Hmm.
by either buying renewable energy, figuring out your supply chain where you have the most emissions, and how can you reduce it either by changing suppliers or working with suppliers to do that. But then, as I mentioned, all of these activities take a couple of years. If you are a big organization, changing supply chains take time, and this is where in the immediate thing is the carbon offsetting which comes into picture, which can be done fairly quickly once you have the carbon footprint, right? So that way they are sort of supplementary, complementary, and can be done simultaneously.
Right. Um, Perfect. Thank you for that question, Lauren. Okay, next question is from Sabine. And they ask, does carbon offsets make sense for a small company? So maybe a company that doesn't have as big of an impact.
I think it makes sense for everyone. I mean, we collectively have an impact, individuals, smaller companies, larger companies. And I
Hmm.
think it makes sense much more for smaller companies because, I mean, smaller companies have less, power from working with suppliers. They don't have that much leeway. They either change a supplier or, figure out something completely different. So the carbon offsetting really makes sense for smaller companies much more than larger companies, as larger companies can work with suppliers. They have enough resources to look at their entire operations and figure out savings. So yeah, it definitely makes sense for smaller companies too. I think Kari's Internet has frozen. Okay, I think Kari's probably internet is frozen. I can probably take a look at the questions directly. Hey, Kari, you there?
Hey, I'm back.
Hey, Kari. Okay.
So sorry about that, everyone. My internet just cut out for a second. I think that we were just taking a look at Aicha's question that I'll just repeat so that everyone remembers, is refreshed. So Aicha asked, do you think it would be greenwashing if a brand is not trying to reduce or insetting its carbon emissions, but only offsetting? Would it be an easy way out?
I think that's a great question. And I mean, the answer is yes and no. So if a brand is only doing or starting with carbon offsetting or carbon neutral in the short term, I think it's okay to use that as a methodology. But at the same time, they need to start looking immediately into how they can further reduce their emissions over the long term, which might be a year or two, if they have a proper policy in place and already figured out a strategy as to how they're reducing emissions, then starting with carbon offsetting is pretty okay.
Okay, awesome. And Vanessa has asked, you mentioned water neutral on our last slide there. How does this work?
Right. So basically, I mean, when we do a lot of life cycle assessment, we find that a lot of, especially fiber production and fashion, uses a lot of water during, dyeing and agriculture phase. For example, cotton has one of the highest water, consumption among all the fibers, and this is where the concept of water neutral comes in. So if you look at Gold Standard, has a few projects which, figure out water purification or provide more access to water to people who do not have that much water or do not have clean water. So basically, how water neutral works is it's similar as carbon offsetting, where you figure out, okay, what's your water consumption, and then you buy water credits, which are one water credit would be 1,000 liters of water, which is either in a purified form or made accessible to those kind of places where there's water scarcity.
Right, right. Very interesting. So we have a question from Eddie here, and it says, where does the money spent on a carbon credit go if the project has already been set up and paid for? For example, a wind farm, does it go towards maintenance, or what happens with that?
Right. So I mean, typically projects are financed, which means somebody has taken a loan or financing from a bank to get the project out. And when we buy credits, finally this financing goes back to the project developer, who can pay off the loan and make some maybe profit out of it a bit. But
Right.
also it definitely goes in terms of maintenance, because a lot of projects, renewable energy projects, have to be maintained. Typically, the pricing for renewable projects is slightly lower, because once the projects are operational, they can actually sell the renewable energy and make profit out of that while the project is running. So the cost here goes both towards paying off the initial financing and then for the maintenance of the projects.
Right. And especially with those longer scale products, they would definitely need to be maintained.
Yeah, especially like reforestation. In those cases, you have to, get the leases for 100 years just to make sure the emissions are permanent. You have to make sure, land is protected. So all of those things keep happening. You have to do continuous audits to ensure that the emissions are actually, getting avoided or removed. So that's where all the money goes towards.
Right, right. Okay, and the next question is from Sebastian. And they say, this is such an amazing way for companies to showcase their sustainable approach and support the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Agreed. What are the main carbon offset requirements to be able to jump on board the Green Story program?
Yeah, I mean, there are no main requirements. What typically is required, obviously, we need to first calculate the footprint. So we'll need to know the supply chain, locations, and what kind of products you have, what kind of technology you are using to calculate the footprint. That's the first essential part.
Hmm.
And then, from a value chain perspective, obviously, how are you shipping, where are customers located, so we can calculate the use phase impact based on the location or the country of the customer. Once you
Hmm.
have all this data, then you can start figuring out the offset projects. And typically, we'll try to find projects which is based on your supply chain. So if you are using resources from example Bangladesh, then we would want to have a project there so that number one, the future emissions are avoided in that industry. There's much more renewable energy in that location, and also
Hmm.
benefits accrue to the communities where you're using the resources from. So that's how we'll select the projects based on your supply chain geographies. And we have a whole bunch of projects which you can select from. Typically, we provide recommendations based on your supply chain, and then it's just a matter of selecting whether it works with your company, your customers, and then go right in.
Awesome. So no huge requirements, just come to us and we can basically sort it out.
Yes.
Awesome. There's a few more questions in the chat here. So another question from Sabine. And they ask, can a fashion company find a project in the fashion industry to offset its carbon footprint, or are all projects in the energy and other sectors?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by fashion industry. Mostly projects are renewable energy. We can find projects where your industries are located nearby regions,
Mhm.
but finding project in the fashion industry might be tough. In case a bigger fashion company has an offset project which they're doing due to regulatory requirements, and it has additional credits to sell, those can, we can find that, but it might be tough.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Next question here. Just going to scan through. Um, So we'll go to Lauren's question. Quantifying carbon emissions can be such a daunting task for companies both large and small. Is this process something that requires the use of an independent auditor, or is it possible to learn how to calculate carbon emissions within your own company?
Right. So, it requires specialized knowledge definitely for the carbon footprint. So, finding if you're just a brand and if you have simple operations, calculating the footprint of your own operations, for example, employee travel and use of let's say electricity for your office buildings, those should be fairly easy, and there are tons of calculators available online. But calculating the footprint across your entire supply chain, that definitely requires specialized knowledge. Either you have to follow the GHG protocol, product footprint, or you have to follow the LCA methodology. Um,
Hmm.
so that's number one. Second is, it requires all of the life cycle data to calculate, the emissions from electricity uses or different processes, heat and water used in dyeing process. So all of that is required, and you need a specialized knowledge to do that, which
Hmm.
Green Story does have. But there are also independent LCA professionals who can help you calculate the footprint for your product.
Totally. Um, and we have a follow-up to Aicha's question that we asked just a little earlier, and this is coming from Jess, and they've asked, with Aicha's question, how does e-commerce fit with this? If you're selling sustainable products and offsetting, but still shipping products to and from people around the world, is offsetting enough?
Right. In e-commerce, what happens is you're also offsetting the shipping
Mm,
to the customer. So we're offsetting across the entire value chain, including manufacturing, distribution, shipping to the customer, and also customer use phase. So when customer does laundry and drying of the product based on your care instructions, we'll also offset that. And
mhm,
it's really important to offset shipping emissions because that's something which is, I would say, unavoidable in a lot of scenarios in case of e-commerce. So offset is a really useful method to offset shipping and use phase emissions.
mhm,
And in terms of e-commerce, even if you're using sustainable products, based on a lot of our clients use sustainable products, but let's say a product's footprint is about 6 or 8 kgs. By using sustainable fabrics, you might have saved about a couple of kgs
Hmm.
of emissions, but then there's still about 6 kg of emissions left, which is difficult to reduce in the short term. So offset is
Hmm.
the only sort of possible solution if you want to go net zero today.
Right. Awesome. That's great. That looks like all the questions that pertain to our topic today. If there are any other questions, you can quickly shoot them in the chat box or join our discussion online. So we'll just wrap up here then. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in, our amazing audience for coming and spending this lunch break Eastern Standard Time with us. And thank you for your questions. They were really great. And if you do have any questions that you weren't able to get to today or that you think of after the fact, you can keep an eye out on our social media and for our newsletter. You can join the discussion. Our handle is on the screen right there. And we have a whole series of webinars this week. So if you want to learn more, you can tune in to our webinars throughout the week. And tomorrow, we're going to be talking about cultivating carbon-free communities. And that is at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. And also, we'll be sending out a video replay of mine and Nav's discussion today. And that'll be emailed to all of you. And we'll also be posting a summary on our blog if you wanted to take a peek. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope that you have a great Monday.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.